All right. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Dan Petrik, and the Shoreland Program Manager at the DNR. I've probably spoken with many of you or emailed many of you about a wide variety of shoreland issues, and I'm glad you could join us today. And with me today is...
I'm Matt Bauman. You might have heard from me during floodplain administration. I helped Dan with the Shoreline Basics presentation. I gave the higher standards, the Shoreline Higher Standards presentation earlier this week. And I work with both the floodplain and shoreland river-related programs as in a planner role. This is mostly Dan's presentation, but I'll be joining in to kind of break up the monotony.
So anyway, so today we're going to cover variances in shoreland. We will have a couple slides in there on floodplain variances, but by and large, this is a shoreland discussion today. And for those of you who have seen this before, we have added a few new slides dealing with conditions, and so we're very interested in your feedback on that discussion as well. So let's get going. So for those of you who've been in this business for a while, you know that under state statute, there are 5 criteria for approving variances. And for those of you who feel interactive today, we'd be curious if any of you want to give us a shout out of what you think any of the 5 are. If you can think of just one, just drop it into the chat box. It always helps to have a little interaction here. So anybody know what any of the 5 are that they want to share with others?
Not solely economic justification.
Thanks, Kurt.
Practical difficulties.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. That's nice to hear. So yes, we have the statutory criteria, and I usually don't think this is good practice to put this sort of stuff on a slide, but for those of you who aren't familiar with this, I really encourage you to go to one of these statutory provisions and read the language in its entirety. It's the same for both cities and counties. And immersed in all this are 5 criteria, and we will summarize those in a bit. But practical difficulties is definitely mentioned here, and there are 3 subcomponents of practical difficulties, and it has to do with a reasonable manner, unique circumstances, and essential character. Those are sort of the 3 buzzwords, but we're going to come back to all those in a moment. This provision also states one of the things that someone just mentioned. First of all, financial or economic conditions alone can't constitute practical difficulties. We know that in most cases, some kind of economic consideration comes into play, but the challenge for your Board of Adjustment is determining if the desire to do a project at the lowest possible cost is a driving motivator. And if it is, then statute says that you can't consider those as a practical difficulties, and it probably should be denied. But also, statute states that only area variances can be considered no use variances. And so an area variance is any use that one authorizes a land use not normally permitted by a zoning district here. So in this monopoly example, a variance to allow a hotel in a residential district is prohibited by law. An area variance is really, think about it as a dimensional variance, you know, a variance to setback standards or building height or that sort of thing. So anyhow, that's just an introduction to this process, and here are the 5 criteria summarized for you. We're going to go through each one of these today and look at it through the lens of shoreland protections. But before we get into the details here, we want to talk about some best practices up front and get you thinking about these. We're going to return to this concept at the end of discussion today about a process for making decisions. We are definitely supporting the idea that you make a decision on the variance first, and then if you make a decision to approve, you discuss conditions. and we will talk about the decision-making process through the bulk of our presentation, but we see this as sort of a two-step dance. You make a decision to approve, and then you discuss variant conditions, and you don't think about conditions as a way to say yes. So more on that to come. And one other thing we want to mention is that a prior decision that your Board of Adjustment or community might make on a type of variance doesn't set a precedent. Each property is unique. Every decision is unique. You have to evaluate each variance application on its own merit. And Minnesota courts have supported this idea that there is really no idea of precedent setting in the world of variances. Each one is unique, and you can make different decisions on variances which might seem like they're very similar. So for the next hour, though, we're going to go through a sample variance through the Shoreland lens. We're going to look at each five. We're going to cover each of the five criteria, and we're going to look at some practical tools for how your Board of Adjustment can make good findings. And then we're going to finally talk about a decision-making approach and how conditions play into that. So with that, Matt's going to give us our example and start us off.
Sure, thanks, Dan. So like Dan said, we're going to walk through the process of evaluating a specific variance application. So we're going to examine the application based on each one of the five statutory criteria one by one, and our evaluation is going to focus on the facts of the application itself, and we're going to develop strong, legally defensible variance findings to support our decision. So in this request, the applicants are proposing to build an addition onto an existing house on a 4-acre lot. The house currently meets Bluff setback, but it's right up against that setback, which is 30 feet from the top of the bluff. And to build this addition, the applicants need two variances. They want to build an addition that will extend 10 feet into the bluff setback, and they also want to create a walkout in the lower level. And to create that walkout, they need to grade the area extensively, and as such, they would intensively remove any of the trees as part of that grading project, and that would be within the bluff impact zone. So they need more room, and they bought the house with a walkout in mind because it will afford better views of the river, and other properties in the area also on the bluff also have a walkout design. But these are older homes, and they were built before the Shoreland Ordinance or bluff protections were put in place. There's been some cutting on the bluff to open up the views, and the bluff is actively eroding. The river segment has been identified as impaired for sediment and nutrients. So some of those things will factor into our decision making. So as mentioned, each of our variance criteria should be evaluated individually. The local government is responsible to document these legally defensible variance findings to weigh that project against each of our statutory criteria. So reviewing them one by one, here's our first one. Is the variance in harmony with the intent and purpose of the ordinance? This is from statute. And on the screen is a fairly typical finding that we've actually seen, so we have to document our findings through the meeting. And the finding in this case, the local government made, is the variance is in harmony with the intent and purpose of the ordinance. Now, is this a good finding? Is there anything that's missing here? Say why? It's missing the facts, no real detail. It's all correct. Not really supported by much of anything. I would agree. So a variance request is a balancing test that requires our need to weigh an individual property owner's rights against the purpose of the local land use regulations. So these regulations are designed for the public good, and there's many reasons for shoreline regulations. state shoreland rules establish minimum standards that allow development in these shoreland areas, but in a manner that doesn't degrade the resources. It's meant to retain property values, protect the natural characteristics of lakes and rivers, and they're implemented through local ordinances that apply evenly to everybody. Now, these standards were developed through broad public process and determined to be a reasonable balance. And if someone wishes to deviate from them, your community must look at the purpose and intent of the shoreland standards and decide if the gain to the individual results in a cost to the public resource. But sometimes the purpose of a standard isn't all that clear at first glance, and it's typically not detailed in an ordinance. So a good resource is the SONAR, which is the Statement of Need and Reasonableness, and that accompanies all rules or most rules at the time they go through the public hearing process. And the SONAR gets into the purposes of certain rule provisions. And the SONAR for the shoreland rules is available on the DNR's Variance website. We have a Variance website that Dan's going to introduce you to. The next slide is an example of a better finding, and it's written in the format of the template available on that Variance website. We call it our formula for variance findings, and it's a template to help guide local officials through the process of making legally defensible variance findings. Board of Adjustment should be working through each of these five criteria one by one and weighing the merits of the application against the statutory criteria. The underlined words are blanks in this template and meant to be filled in by the Board of Adjustments in a manner that's relevant to whatever variance requests you're processing. The other words are pre-printed. So this helps keep all members of the Board of Adjustments literally on the same page and focused. And I think just about anybody that's attended a public meeting knows how easy it is for a group to stray away from the point where no one is even sure what the question is. And the Board of Adjustments they're a quasi-judicial decision-making body, and they should focus on the facts themselves as it relates to the statutory criteria. So in this finding, we're detailing the purposes of the Bluff provisions, why they exist, and to approve it, we have to make the case that the proposal is in harmony with the general purposes of our Bluff provisions. Now, in these findings, we're making the case that the proposal is not in harmony and intent with the Bluff provisions. Next slide. This criteria is often overlooked, but it's equally important. Is the variance consistent with the comprehensive plan? And I know how familiar we all are with our comprehensive plan. It often sits on the shelves and we never open it after creating the thing. And that's all too true. But that comprehensive plan was developed in an open process, and that guides the goals of your community. Now, here's a real finding from a variance decision. You know, again, it's typical of many we've seen. And, you know, oftentimes communities will look at this criteria along with the other one. So, you know, I think that they should be reviewed individually. And again, you know, take a look at this finding and ask yourself what's missing. So this finding doesn't specify goals and policies as they apply to the comprehensive plan, or how this request is consistent with those goals and policies for the plan itself. Next slide, Dan. The local comp plan, the water plan, or other local resource plans establish kind of a framework for achieving a community's vision. And most plans contain these goals and policies for protecting natural resources and to guide local land use decisions. Now comp plans will often have goals and policies that also promote economic development, as well as those that are designed to protect the natural resources. And they seemingly kind of conflict with one another. But the important thing to remember is in shorelands, the variance requests must be considered with all pertinent goals and policies in mind, all of them, not just the select few. So findings must explain whether or not the proposed variance is consistent with those goals and policies. Now, our comp plans contain many things besides just goals and policies. We might have maps detailing sensitive areas where development should be avoided or where special consideration should be given. This map on the screen is from Crow Wing County, and they have a watershed risk classification map and how water quality differs within each of those subwatersheds. And this is one of those things that could be used to decide whether or not to approve a variance with certain conditions. So the next slide is a better finding, and it cites specific goals and policies and explains how the request is, or in this case, is not consistent with them.
We're going to start with the first of the three practical difficulties, and this one is unique circumstances. And this is often, I think, the deciding factor. If there are no unique circumstances, meaning nothing that distinguishes a particular property from others in the same shoreland area, the variance should be denied. So on the screen is again another typical finding that is something we've seen before. And does this finding spell out what's different about the property or justify why an applicant should be able to deviate from the standard? It appears that this is this really a circumstance of unique physical limitation or unique to the property owner's desire to have a walkout? I think that in this case here, we could probably say that this finding was written from the perspective of the property owner and not necessarily the property. So thanks, Christy. Yep, that's exactly right. And this is not atypical. It's really about a perspective that your Board of Adjustment brings to the table and how they look at things. So here are some considerations to help guide this discussion. I think, first of all, what physically distinguishes this property from others in the shoreland area? Shoreland areas are, typically have bluffs or wetlands or difficult soils to work with, and that's common, not unique to shoreland areas, and is one of the reasons why we have the shoreland rules, is to guide development in these more sensitive areas in a way that's appropriate for those sensitive areas. You should not be comparing a shoreland property to a typical suburban tract, that was maybe created out of a cornfield. So, it's really important to think about the surrounding environment and how is this land really different from any other land. Also, you want to make sure that the difficulties weren't created by the applicant or by their design preference. And then also, a key question here that we're going to come back to later is, has the applicant demonstrated that there are no other feasible alternatives? If they have really gone through this process and you've come to the conclusion that there aren't, that's a very important fact to find. So with that in mind, let's look at our sample. Again, this is our good example here of what a finding might look like. And again, you can see a pattern here in our findings. In this case, there aren't any unique circumstances. This is a large lot with sufficient area to add livable area, square footage, that meet the setbacks and doesn't compromise the bluff. And so in this case, it's clear that the desire for a walkout is a design preference and not a physical limitation. So, all right, moving on to the next one. Would granting the variance allow the essential character to remain the same? So take a look at this. So oftentimes we automatically think about architecture, appearance, or color when considering essential character. And that might make sense in other environments. But for protecting shoreline resources, essential character is much more than that. We have to think about hydrology, the impervious surfaces, how does water move across and through or under the site? How will topography be affected to accommodate the proposal, and what happens to that land? How much vegetation will be removed? And, what does this do to a bluff and potential erosion? And so these are all things that obviously haven't been considered in this finding. And of course, these are things that we can definitely consider in our report to the Board of Adjustment, and guide the Board of Adjustment through this discussion, in helping them make good findings. And so in this series of considerations, one of the most important questions is, does the variance provide minimal relief or substantial deviation? And when we've put it on this particular slide for this criteria, this again is something that is sort of a big picture question. And I think you can, the idea of a variance is to allow some deviation when the strict application would be a hardship. But, do you need to give a mile to provide reasonable accommodation, or will giving an inch be a reasonable accommodation? So, this idea of minimal relief or substantial deviation is really an important question to keep in mind. Yeah, we've covered these
Dan,
other
there's a
things here.
question in the chat. What about vegetation? Colors can change over time. Will there be a condition that the colors must remain?
Well, I think that's a question for your particular community and what's important to your community in terms of character. I think for the Shoreland perspective, vegetation is an extremely important issue about keeping, vegetation in place to screen structures, to provide habitat, to slow down and infiltrate water. Vegetation is an extremely important character of shoreland and an important physical characteristic to protect water quality and habitat. And so I think that's a really top consideration. If you're talking about colors of a building, I think that's of a lesser issue. Certainly if somebody is proposing bright red in a shoreland area, that might jar people in the community, and maybe that isn't considered something you want to allow. But you could certainly, if that is a problem, have a condition. If otherwise the project was acceptable, you could have a condition saying, the building has to be brown or something like that. So anyway, moving on. Here again, we have our better finding. And again, we're talking about the essential character here will be affected by this variance for a lot of the same reasons. Tree removal, it'll be very visible. Hydrology is going to be substantially affected by the removal of all the trees, and the slope stability is going to be affected. So therefore, we don't find that this criteria is satisfied either. So moving on to the very last one, this one is actually very similar to the first one that Matt covered. And this is asking the question if the applicant proposes to use the property in a reasonable manner not permitted by the ordinance. This is probably the most misunderstood criterion. While this finding here starts to explain how the legal requirement is met, it's fundamentally written from the perspective of what's reasonable for the property owner. And the statutory criteria actually says what's reasonable, what's a reasonable manner not permitted by the ordinance. So this is actually supposed to be interpreted and applied from the perspective of the ordinance. So this is an important concept to communicate to your Board of Adjustment if they're not familiar with it already. And again, here are some considerations to help that discussion along. Again, calling up the purpose of the bluff setback and the bluff impact zone. Why are they in your ordinance? What are they trying to do? Would this variance undermine those protections? So okay, let's just kind of move on to sort of just a summary here. The practical difficulties criteria are laid out here. Again, economic considerations alone don't constitute practical difficulties. So we're going to touch on a couple floodplain topics here. Matt?
Yeah, just like 2 quick slides on floodplain variances specifically, since floodplain variances are rare, as they should be. Floodplain standards are there for good reason, and any kind of relaxation of those standards has the potential to expand risk. So your floodplain ordinance will have additional variance criteria beyond what's in statute. And there's federal requirements, and then there's an additional state requirement. Number 1 here on the screen for the federal requirements, you cannot cause any flood stage increase or additional threats to public safety. And that's broadly just expanding risk. And that's largely on the same page as the state requirements there at the bottom of the slide. Variances shall not provide for a lesser degree of flood protection than stated in standards. So, I mean, that one right there, there's really very few instances where a floodplain variance would even pass that test. So right there, that just eliminates most any kind of floodplain variance from consideration. Now, there still are a handful of those that we do see from time to time. But I mean, either way, floodplain variances should be rare. So where a community has violated these provisions, it can risk a community's eligibility to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. So FEMA looks at a community's patterns of granting floodplain variances, and they would want to see some kind of a pattern of poor decision making to influence any kind of decisions that would put a community's risk in the National Flood Insurance Program in jeopardy. Next page is FEMA's guidance document on variances in floodplain, and they have an official FEMA publication that guides a community's decision-making process as it relates to variances in floodplain.
All right, thanks, Matt. Now let's turn to a discussion about conditions. So, if we're looking at a situation that didn't support approval, we really wouldn't be talking about conditions. But suppose this variance had been approved, then what conditions would be appropriate? To know first, you'd have to evaluate what the impacts are. And in this case, there are many impacts, so you probably wouldn't be granting this particular variance. But if they did support them, you would want to look at what the impacts are in terms of increased runoff or structural encroachment, increased visibility, decreased habitat, and then you could determine something that was reasonable to protect them. And there's quite a few options out there. We're not going to go into those today. Particularly, we're going to be focused more on process. But we all know that conditions really need to be related to and proportional to the impact to hold up in court. So you might look at a variance that might allow somebody 500 more or 1,000 more square feet of impervious surface. An ideal condition would be to at least restore that much area of riparian buffer. That would be something that would be related to and proportional and would be likely held up if that were ever challenged. So the point is just to make sure that this concept is considered in the development of any condition. So, but where this gets interesting is to think about the philosophy your organization, your community uses in making variance decisions. We've been sort of observing this for a while and kind of come up with sort of, it appears to be sort of 2 basic approaches. One that we have been talking about thus far today is that you make a decision first based on the merits and the facts, and then if a decision is made to approve, you move forward and consider conditions. Okay, this is the quasi-judicial approach. You're looking at the facts of the case. You're looking at the facts of the case in relationship to what the law in your community says, and you make an unbiased decision. Alternatively, we often see that communities start thinking about conditions through the whole variance hearing process. And it's, it's difficult to, it's like an elephant in the room sometimes. It's hard not to think about what conditions might be, especially if you have a letter, from the DNR saying, or your local soil and water conservation district saying, well, if you were to approve this variance, here are some conditions we'd highly recommend. So this is sort of a difficult process to weed out sometimes, but I think your approach can make a big difference. And oftentimes, if you're thinking about conditions as you're making the variance decision, it sometimes might come across as thinking about what's reasonable for the property owner versus what's reasonable given the purpose of the standard. And so that's why we really think it's important to stay focused on the facts of the case and making a decision first on the proposal. And so staff, you can certainly help your Board of Adjustment with this process to keep them focused on the facts at hand. And if they do make a decision then to approve, then you can turn the mindset or discussion to appropriate variances. And so this is just to recap our earlier discussion about best practices. We really encourage communities to make a decision first and then move on to conditions if the decision is to approve. But oftentimes, you get stuck into these processes that are complex and controversial, and you sort of lose track of what's what. And I think if you boil down our whole previous discussion, this is essentially something to keep in mind. Variances should only be approved when there are unique and unusual hardship created by the physical characteristics of the land, if the ordinance were to be strictly and literally applied. That's really what we're talking about. And, just to sort of help cut through the chase here, we've distilled down all of the criteria and considerations that we've been talking about to help your board stay focused on their quasi-judicial role and make decisions on fact. And so here are really what we believe to be the fundamental questions to always keep in the forefront. And if the answer to these questions is no, then the variance is likely being driven by design preferences and the variance should be denied. So, the basic questions here, you've all heard these today already, but first of all, is there really a physical limitation or uniqueness of the property itself? Is someone asking for minimal deviation or a substantial deviation? Instead of maybe, a few percentages of impervious surface, they want to build, a 4,000 square foot single story house on a 6,000 square foot lot. Is that really minimal deviation or is that a substantial deviation? And then lastly, has the applicant demonstrated that there are no other feasible alternatives that meet the standard? And this is an area where we've seen, at least in the public setting realm, that this is not discussed very often. Many communities will have a pre-application meeting with applicants where this is really hammered out, and communities have really pushed applicants to do this. And if they don't, then staff will certainly make that clear in their staff reports. But many communities don't approach this, and applicants are never really asked to demonstrate other alternatives. And so it's important for your Board of Adjustment to know about this process and to be shown that there was this demonstration that you went through to help with this reality check. And so alternatively, here's sort of some top level guidance on when it might make sense to approve. You've determined that there really is bona fide physical uniqueness. This applicant is really asking for minimal relief, and we've gone through the alternatives, either in a pre-application meeting, or this has been explained in a public hearing for the Board of Adjustment and the public to hear. And you've determined that there are no feasible alternatives. And just a note on this, we've sort of covered this before, but feasible sometimes sounds like just financial cost, but it's more than that. It's the resource impact. There are true costs to our environment, to our recreational resources, to our water quality that are affected by these decisions. And so, it's important to be thinking about what is feasible, and it's not just cost to the applicant. It's the cost to the community of resource impacts. And so just to sort of wrap this up here, Minnesota statute certainly allows boards of adjustment to request applicants to demonstrate material adverse effect. If your community is shy about asking applicants to really justify their proposal, statute provides you the backup to say, yeah, no, we don't quite believe that we have enough information here. We think there's some problems. We need you to go back and provide us some more information so we can adequately evaluate the effects on the environment. And so now let's just think about how can this process be improved. This is sort of a higher standard, if you will, for variances. And we're calling this sort of required mitigation. And there's in a sense two ways that this could be applied. It could be required mitigation for variances approved by a board of adjustment, or you could do this through an administrative process. Maybe your ordinance has been modified to allow certain deviations. Cities, for example, are allowed by ordinance to allow expansion of nonconformities. So, you can write this sort of thing into your ordinance and then require mitigation so that there's some consistency to how these variances are approached. And so if you were to think about some of these things, here are some of the elements that we would recommend. First of all, it has to be authorized in your ordinance. And if it's a deviation to your shoreland ordinance to allow some of this stuff, this is something that the DNR would have to review and approve. But you need to be specific. Expansions of non-conforming structures is a great example. Additions of impervious surface. There could be other things. And these are things that oftentimes maybe your community is granting variances for. They come up repeatedly, and your Board of Adjustment is spending a lot of time on a lot of these things. And maybe they're making similar decisions, or they're making decisions that could be improved. And so by putting required mitigation into your ordinance, you can assure that there's some consistency in how these things are addressed, and that the resource is adequately protected. And so, that's the third element here, is that the mitigation is very clearly specified in your ordinance, and then staff can carry out the measures in working with the applicant. And then lastly, for this sort of process, you might have very specific information requirements that you need to be collected from the applicant to fulfill sort of the deliberation and decision that the planning or the Board of Adjustment might make, and for developing the specific mitigation. So, for example, here, this is something that the City of Victoria has on their books for allowing expansion of non-conforming structures in shoreland. There's some criteria involved with this here. These are structures that don't meet the ordinary high water setback, but they're not in the shore impact zone. So that sort of defines the eligibility. Any expansion, though, would be limited to 25 feet. The expansion property has to meet the impervious surface standard, meaning they have to be under 25% or at 25%. And the required mitigation for allowing this expansion is restoration of a riparian buffer for 80% of the shoreline to a depth of at least 10 feet. And that buffer is defined to include trees, shrubs, and ground cover consistent with sort of the natural vegetation environment of that part of the state. And so This is an approach that a few communities have used, and this makes sense and is something the DNR has approved. We are all about trying to create healthy and natural shorelines, and restoring vegetative buffers is our priority, and that's always a sound mitigation strategy in our book. We don't agree with wildly approving variances, but there are certainly situations where variances make some sense. Now here's another example of the Carnelian Marine St. Croix Watershed District requires the restoration and permanent protection of buffers for any variance approved by local governments within their district. And so here there's a requirement for a restoration for any setback and impervious surface variance. The standard requires a buffer width anywhere from 25 to 100 feet, I think depending on the resource. There has to be some sort of documentation of the restoration plan, and it has to be recorded with an easement. So this is also a very good mitigation approach, or a condition of approval, if you will. And then also, again, statute provides support for these sorts of mitigation requirements. Both county and state planning enabling statutes state that for variances on non-conforming lots, at least, local governments shall require mitigation. And then there's some weasel words in statute that say when appropriate. But of course, local governments can take away the when appropriate and actually specify what type of mitigation shall be employed. So, and then just lastly, just want to point out that the shoreline rules do require reconstruction of non-conforming septic systems whenever a permit or variance of any type is required. So if you're not doing this today, even though your ordinance might say it, it's important to, as part of the variance process, to investigate the status of a septic system, and if it is non-conforming, then it needs to be upgraded or brought into compliance in whatever shape or form it needs to come into compliance, other than setback. That's written in our rules. If it doesn't meet the setback requirements, that does not qualify as a non-conforming septic system. So with that, I just want to make a pitch for our webpage that talks about variances. We have a lot of guidance documents about what a variance is and the criteria, essentially the presentation we covered today. We have some case studies or examples for setbacks from ordinary high water level, impervious surface, and floodplain fill. We also have our formula for variance findings that Matt mentioned, and some links to the criteria in state law. So,
hey Dan, there was a question in the chat. How would you explain the difference between the old hardship criteria and the current practical difficulty criteria?
Well, there's a variety of ways to answer that. In many ways, they were sort of interchangeable words. There were some specific changes that were made, and so long ago now that's not really top of mind. One of the important reasons for that change, though, was to make both county and city criteria the same. Before, they used different terms in different ways, and it didn't really provide consistency in how these things were addressed throughout the state. So anyway, now they're consistent, they're the same. The one thing that I think that does come to my mind is that it talked about sort of, I think, reasonable use. I think it might have been in the city provisions instead of reasonable manner. And I think the reasonable manner approach maybe is a little more vague than the reasonable use manner might have been. But again, I'm sort of working from some vague memories on this, so I can't really speak to that all that much, sorry. So, Matt, was there anything else that you wanted to add, or was there anything that we have missed that you can think of?